Is building traditional architecture too expensive? And is it more expensive than building modernist buildings? Every time someone makes the case for building traditional architecture, it is predictably this one question that is raised. After all, we're facing a massive housing shortage today, and we need to build as much as possible. That's why many people already draw their conclusion, but it's too expensive to build like that. This immediately kills the discussion, because obviously we can't afford it. But is it really true? In this video we're going to do a deep dive into the question of building costs and give a breakdown of elements that lead to pleasant traditional buildings and see if they are expensive or not. But to make the comparison complete, we'll also look at the costs of modernist buildings. After all, there are many modernist buildings that aren't cheap at all. But why is that? Not only that, we'll also dive into reducing costs, the question of quality, and how our current obsession with short-term profits leads to far worse things than only ugly buildings. But that isn't all. We will also look at why building beautifully might just be worth the cost. Because even if it costs a bit extra, does that really matter? And what if there is a hidden upside to building beautifully? I heard that this is a video many of you have been waiting for and have been planning to do it for a long time. So I'm super excited to finally tackle this topic. Let's get started. First, before we start, a disclaimer. This video is the result of countless conversations with architects and other experts. But even though I took great care to get a clear image about building costs, it is an extremely complex issue, and I'm not perfect. So feel free to comment and come with interesting examples and proof. I can't wait to read it. With that out of the way, let's dive in. When the question of the cost of traditional architecture comes up, many people immediately think of buildings that are clad with an abundance of intricately carved stone ornament. And envision armies of craftsmen working for years to craft all this stonework at exorbitant costs. But that's a rather distorted and incomplete view of things. Because although handcrafted stone ornament is indeed expensive, it isn't even necessary or used in most new traditional buildings. And some modernist buildings without any handcrafted ornament can be much more expensive. For example, which building is more expensive, do you think? If you thought it was the left building, you'd be very wrong. The left building is the reconstruction of the Stadtschloss in Potsdam, Germany, and it cost 135 million euros, including all the stone ornaments. While the right building, the new National Art Museum in Oslo, cost 630 million euros. But I hear you say they might not be the same size. Well, I looked up the gross floor space of these two buildings and accounted for inflation, and found a cost per square meter, adjusted for the price levels of 2022 of around 11,500 euros for the modernist Oslo Museum and around 5,700 euros for the classical Potsdam City Palace. That means that the classical building was about 2 times cheaper than the modern museum. Even though this is a quite shocking comparison, these comparisons are a bit problematic. It's hard to compare such projects because of the wildly different context where they are built. Now, is there a better way to look at construction costs? One that is more universal? When we want to know if traditional buildings are more expensive than modernist buildings, we can also take a different approach. We can look at the design elements that make a building traditional versus what makes buildings modernist, and try to see what these elements generally cost, regardless of location or time. But most importantly, we need to make sure we compare apples to apples. What do I mean by that? We should not be comparing low-quality modernist buildings to high-quality traditional buildings. Because of course a cheap box made out of plywood and vinyl siding will be cheaper than a high-quality building with a brick facade. Comparing those two buildings would be an unfair comparison. The real question is how a modernist building of decent quality, so using proper building materials, compares to a traditional building of similar quality. Also, we need to recognize that construction costs are hyper-local. They can be wildly different in different contexts. In Oslo, there might be different labor costs, material costs, than in Potsdam, or in Kansas for that matter. Even within the same region, construction costs can be different between different towns. To make matters even more complex, these costs constantly change as well. This makes it almost impossible to look at specific examples or compare building projects in different countries or even towns, or to do so in a fair way at least. It's probably more useful to look at construction costs from a first principles approach, by looking at the general cost of individual design characteristics. In other words, what design elements of buildings are inherently cheap or expensive to create, due to the amount of labor or the materials that are chosen. First, we'll look at building costs that are shared by both traditional buildings and modernist buildings. Then we'll look at characteristics of traditional buildings and of modernist buildings and what they cost. Only then can we start drawing some conclusions. This way we operate slightly more independently from the wildly different contexts where they are built. Knowing the context is always important, by the way, because if you don't, you get an unreliable image of reality. Today's media landscape doesn't always give this nuanced view of reality. The stories we read are often sensationalist and biased, which means that we are left in the dark about what actually happens. For this reason, I like to get my news from the Ground News app and website, because they offer a way to get a balanced view of publications so that we can make better decisions. A good example is this news story about a clash between Cuomo and Zoran in New York. Ground News lets me compare a total of 43 sources about this story. This includes headlines from various left and right-leaning publications. And as you can see, how they frame the story is quite different. These headlines are clearly anti-Cuomo, while at the right-leaning publications we see quite the opposite. Apart from comparing headlines, we can also look at the biased distribution of publications, but also see their factuality and even ownership. Then there is the blind spot feature, which shows what stories are only reported on by either left or right-leaning publications. I believe that this is a great way to get access to different viewpoints and not falling for one particular bias. And the best thing is that it's ad-free, so you get your news without the sensationalism and doom scrolling. If this sounds good to you, subscribe today to get an exclusive 40% off the Vantage plan by scanning this QR code or using my link ground.news/aesthetic. Again, that's ground.news/aesthetic, or click my link in the description below. Don't wait too long before the promotion ends. Thank you, and let's continue. Let's look at elements that modernist buildings and traditional buildings share. First of all, many might immediately think about land costs. Yes, expensive land will reduce the budget for a building project. But that tight budget applies to any construction project on that land, modernist and traditional. It is simply a given, so although it does matter, for the comparison we can ignore it. Next up are elements like site work, the foundation, HVAC systems, electrical installations, insulation and plumbing. Both a traditional and modernist building need all of those. And together these form another significant part of the building costs. Look at this European cost breakdown, for example, from a study of the Irish Housing Agency, or this one for the US context. It all comes down to this: the elements that distinguish modern traditional buildings from modernist ones in their design are in many cases just a fraction of the total building costs. Now let's break down the aspects in which traditional buildings diverge from modernist ones. First of all, many traditional buildings are symmetrical or have symmetrical features in their facades. Introducing symmetry or local symmetries only means a different configuration of what is already there. Therefore, it doesn't cost anything extra. Next up, traditional buildings normally use warmer colors than modernist ones. Construction materials companies offer their products like bricks or paint in many colors. And for a product line of the same quality, different colors normally cost the same too. Next up are proportions. Using a system of classical proportions means reshaping a volume that is going to be built anyway. Or it means using a classically proportioned window versus one with a random shape, like in modernist buildings. This can even save costs as it makes more structural sense. Having aligned vertical openings is structurally more logical, especially for load-bearing walls. Now, do you see where this is going? Many traditional building characteristics that help make a facade look beautiful and harmonious come at no extra cost. In fact, deviating from these characteristics can come at extra cost. Because most traditional buildings are often very simple. A box with 4 walls and a roof with holes punched into it for windows and doors. Similar practically free design choices are clustering windows or having a tripartite facade design. We can put these in the first column of a model I created to categorize various types of design elements and their costs. This model has 4 brackets: practically free, marginal cost, medium cost and expensive. Now, if you would design a new building with the design characteristics from the practically free bracket, it would still lead to a simple yet pleasant, harmonious building, even without any added ornament. It doesn't have to be terribly expensive. You just need an architect who is great at composing facades. The next bracket consists of elements that add marginal extra cost. So elements that do cost a bit extra, but only a little bit. Think of window surrounds, choosing windows with glazing bars, simple factory-produced ornament, slightly nicer doors, wooden window frames, using a pitched roof, using a cornice, and adding a plinth. Ornaments doesn't always have to mean hand-carved marble acanthus leaves covered in gold. Ornaments can be as simple as a string course that is mechanically produced, or a keystone above a window. Also, ornaments can be mass-produced. We have to remember that ornament is just one element of many things that make a building traditional. And in some cases, especially in 19th century buildings, ornament looks expensive and handcrafted, but it actually wasn't. Factories and workshops mass-produced ornament for affordable prices, and they had entire catalogs that builders could use to pick adornments for their designs. Like this one from 1929. And there's still some companies who make ornaments in larger quantities. Let's look at the marginal cost column again. If you apply many of these elements, the cost can add up. But the beauty is that you often don't need a lot of these elements in the design. And you don't always need them all at the same time. With only the 2 first brackets, you could make very nice buildings that don't cost a lot, while still having an interesting facade and all the right basics. If you need to reduce costs, you can strip down a design. As long as the proportions are right, it won't matter too much. The medium cost bracket adds more complexity to the design, and here we find elements that are often omitted due to cost cutting. More complex massing of buildings is a good example, but also the use of better materials, covering the facade in ornamental stucco, or having complex brick ornaments. Arches are another example, as well as building in load-bearing masonry, which in some markets goes into an even higher bracket. Finally, we arrive at the expensive category. Think of hand-carved stone ornaments, or luxury materials like marble or other materials imported from afar. Very complex massing of the volume of a building, like the beautiful towers by Robert A.M. Stern Architects in New York, can also become expensive. Because every new part of roof you're creating needs to be sealed, adds complexity in construction and thus leads to extra cost. Just look at this modernist tower, and you can probably guess it wasn't cheap to achieve this. And if it was cheap, well, we just have to wait for it to start leaking. Together, these costs form the following model. I've put this in front of quite a few architects and people in the field, and it seems to be generally accurate. I'll add a copy to it on my website. So, those are the general building costs of traditional buildings. But how about the cost of elements that are typically modernist? Let's look at a couple of elements that always add cost. Minimalism. Achieving high-quality architecture that is minimalist requires perfectly flat surfaces, sleek window frames and fittings, and all this expertly built with tight tolerances. This requires custom-tailored solutions, expensive tooling, and expertise, which makes high-quality minimalism very expensive. Cheap minimalism almost always looks very bad, while traditional buildings have an easier time hiding some imperfections with moldings. An extra disadvantage of minimalism is that its aesthetic tends to age like milk and requires a ton of maintenance to keep it all looking tight and clean. While traditional buildings using natural materials will normally age gracefully, which is why using quality materials is important, and using styrofoam should be avoided. Big glass surfaces. Floor-to-ceiling glass might look simple, but it is anything but cheap. The bigger a window, the more expensive it gets. Especially floor-to-ceiling glass panels can get pricey. Complex structural engineering. Many modernist buildings are designed as an architectural gesture, and part of the concept of its design is either an exotic shape or some crazy feat of engineering that carries the entire idea of the building. Think of the Markthal in Rotterdam, which is shaped like a horseshoe and is a massive market hall, its walls and roof consisting of apartments. Or expensive museums like this one, or buildings with a big cantilever. None of these features are really necessary, but without them, these buildings would be very boring. And all this engineering means custom-made solutions and a lot of specialized engineering are needed. And that can become very expensive. As you can see, together these design elements can cost quite a bit of money. Perhaps it's for that reason that many modernist prestige projects, like museums and opera houses, can cost hundreds of millions. The Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg cost a whopping 866 million euros, which was 10 times the initial budget. Of course, incompetence, corruption, permitting issues and general stupidity can drive up costs too. But yet, don't just assume that modern buildings are automatically cheaper, because they often aren't. So what buildings cost is dependent on their design, both in the case of traditional buildings and modernist buildings. Depending on how fancy a modernist building tries to be, or the amount of details added to a traditional building, one might be more expensive than the other. For example, look at this example from Robert Patzke, a leading German traditional architect.
It's 3 office buildings that were commissioned, 2 to us and 1 to a modern architect in Berlin, Grüntuch Ernst. And what was interesting is that actually later on when we calculated, the cost of the facade was the same. They used these huge window panes with very fine metal framing, so also very expensive. And I'm saying this because I think when we look at cost, we always have to compare apples with apples and not different things. So if you have a high quality project, it has a certain budget, no matter what kind of design you do.
Even infrastructure could be beautiful, like this bridge in Newquay, England, by Adam Architecture. It's clad in local granite and arches elegantly over the track and cost £11.8 million. The extra cost of the granite cladding came to about 2.5%, which is modest for something that doesn't detonate with its surroundings for decades to come. In any case, it should absolutely be possible to create very pleasant looking buildings at a budget, using elements like proportion, a tripartite facade division, symmetry and color. Look at Swedish Grace buildings in Stockholm, for example. They are simple and were built for workers, but they are pleasant to look at and are very popular places to live. Or the buildings in Garbatella, some of which were built in just 3 months for working class Romans at affordable prices. But building costs related to the appearance of a building are only part of the story. We have to look at 4 more elements that determine costs. The first one is typology. Housing, for example, comes in different forms of spatial organization, some being more expensive than others. A traditional apartment building with a stairwell and lift servicing a maximum of 3 or 4 apartments per floor is going to be more expensive than a building with a gallery that services 10 apartments. Or, God forbid, some cursed building with double-loaded corridors. Because the money lost on unrentable or unsellable space, the hallways and elevator cores, is divided over more apartments that do earn money. The gallery flat is a cheap way to build because of this lower overhead of space and the repetition of standard apartment sizes. But the downside is a repetitive, sometimes even inhumane and alienating design. Also, galleries take away the opportunities for a balcony on one side of the building. Then, diversity. Building a lot of different designs to create diversity will be more expensive, because you have more different materials, different designs and ornaments, for example. And this costs more than standardized repetition. Traditional design can therefore become more expensive. But by repeating the same type of building in different parts of a neighborhood, costs can be saved by introducing repetition but scattered throughout the project. And with digital design and production processes, the costs of this diversity can be brought down too. Embeddedness is another factor. A freestanding building will need to be insulated, weatherproofed and decorated on all 4 sides. But if you have a closed building block, only the front and back side need to get this special treatment. The street-facing facade is the only one you really need to make super pretty. Obviously, this is more cost-effective than having to do 4 facades. Meanwhile, many modernist buildings are built as sculpture-like objects in free space, as they go together with modernist tower-in-the-park planning. And finally, maintenance costs should not be forgotten. Modernist buildings can have quite a few unexpected indirect costs that appear only when a building has been finished. Think of leakage due to flat roofs being used in rainy climates, or high energy costs because buildings overheat in summer due to too much glass, or smearing and staining due to not having a cornice. Villa Savoye was a disaster, for example. It leaked almost everywhere, and the complaints got so bad that Madame Savoye, the owner, stated that the house was uninhabitable and demanded that Le Corbusier fix it. But traditional buildings have their own indirect costs, like wooden doors and surfaces that need to be painted, and the maintenance of natural materials to keep them looking nice. The question is, of course, which cost more in maintenance costs, modern buildings or traditional buildings? Reply in the comments below. In general, we need to think not only of immediate costs, but what our design choices will cost down the line. By now, you probably wonder, how can we bring down construction costs? Well, first of all, by making it easier to build in general, and by reducing regulations that are not effective or downright harmful, or replacing them with smarter building regulations. Like him or hate him, the quote by Elon Musk does come to mind here. First, make requirements less dumb. Only after that, start deleting parts or optimizing the design. The same could be said of cutting costs in buildings. One way to make buildings cheaper is by using the power of repetition. Building in volume means increasing the number of times elements in buildings can be copied or solutions can be applied, which drives down cost compared to a lot of different custom solutions. This effect helped to make Weespersluis feasible, a project in the Netherlands on which I made a video as well. Building in volume has other benefits. By demanding a higher standard of construction across a very large project, over time, an increased supply of specialists is created, as suppliers and contractors need to hire and train more talent to handle the project. This was one of the things that happened in Poundbury. They needed a lot of craftsmanship, and although this was difficult at first, over time it led to more craftsmen being trained, so the local industry could take on the project easier. But it gets better. Not only Poundbury could use this talent, but other projects in the region could tap into this talent pool too. This is why it's so important to have pathfinder projects like Poundbury. A final way to reduce cost is, as always, by using technology to automate manual tasks, like robots carving stone, laying brick, or 3D printing concrete. There is increasing progress on this front, and robotic building might become a very common thing in a not too distant future. A nightmare for some, a dream for others. As I mentioned earlier, we can only fairly compare buildings with the same quality. But this brings us to another problem, because in many places, it's not a choice between building two high quality buildings, but between building something crappy and something better. And what is better in quality is almost always more expensive. Real brickwork is more expensive than stone strips and vinyl. Cost cutting will lead to reduced quality in each element of the building's design, and higher cost tier elements being scrapped. A nice window is replaced with a worse one, a cheaper type of brick is used, arches are cut, etc. It is the headache of every architect, and understandably so. Here we face the harsh financial reality of today, but we also face stubborn short-term thinking. We create places that look and feel worse to save some costs, which are ultimately demolished earlier. This is of course very unsustainable and over time costs more, because a new building has to be built soon after as replacement. It creates a never-ending cycle of waste that is often toxic, poisoning us and our planet. But should we just embrace this and build concrete boxes as rapidly as we can anyway? Well, building something nice can actually be worth it. Why? Well, we haven't even discussed one of the most obvious upsides: profit and positive externalities. Traditional architecture gains more value over time, as people are willing to pay more for it. This is because traditional buildings look nicer to most people. That's why people generally think they are more valuable, and therefore more expensive. Just like the example of the Stadsschloss in Potsdam and the National Art Museum of Oslo. If you see that museum, you wonder how on earth could that cost so much? While with the Stadsschloss, it looks like it's worth every penny. This effect leads to an interesting phenomenon. Traditional architecture appreciates more in value. This study from 2016 from Buitelaar and Schilder shows that traditional architecture commands a 15% price premium and partly traditional architecture a 5% price premium, showing how it is in higher demand. So even if you would spend more on a traditional design, you would earn it right back. And of course, it leads to communities that are loved by people, places where people flock to, places where people feel better and more connected. And this leads to higher value in return. But then you could say, but doesn't that defeat the purpose of lowering building costs? After all, a beautiful project will just become more popular and expensive. Well, do we solve this problem by not building anything beautiful at all? Because that would make beautiful areas even more scarce, making them even more expensive, and making it even more unfair for people who can't afford to live there. The answer lies, in my opinion, in building as much beauty as we possibly can. Because with more supply of attractive neighborhoods, cost will eventually come down. We are facing another, even deeper question. What do we as a society value? We have to ask ourselves, isn't our obsession with reducing building costs a symptom of a deeper sickness? We are so focused on the spreadsheet and the short-term costs that we don't see the value of doing things better. And we ignore damage that we are doing by creating unlivable, ugly places. Every ugly building we create just pushes our problems to the future and leads to people having to suffer its ugliness for its lifetime. So we all lose. By creating terrible places, we only increase problems like inequality. The rich live in beautiful places and the poor in ugly boxes. Every extra ugly building makes this worse. And what is the cost of building massive, ugly and inhumane housing projects that need to be torn down after only 50 years? We are seeing the effects of the greatest failed experiment in urbanism in cities all around the world. Massive areas filled with single-use tower blocks that are falling apart and are riddled with crime. Or the cost of endless sprawling suburbs and malls that sit empty after just 30 years. Everything we demolish after such a short time is a massive waste of money. But perhaps this is exactly what the economy likes. The more we destroy, the more we have to build back. I believe that somehow we need to do the impossible and rewire ourselves to think of the future more. And to create places that are dignified for all. We used to build incredible cathedrals that took centuries. Because we had a low time preference, we valued the future more than the present, and we were able to delay gratification for a better long-term outcome. It reminds me of the quote of Interstellar. We used to look up at the sky and wonder at our place in the stars. Now we just look down and worry about our place in the dirt. And all that while we're even richer today than ever before in history. The negative cultural shift might be the hardest thing to fight. But that's why I started this channel, to show people that although it is hard, better is possible. And places like Le Plessis-Robinson prove it. And if I can somehow show affordable ways forward, some brave developers and builders may try to go for that route. And that makes all the difference. So, is traditional architecture more expensive than modernist architecture? Well, sometimes. Sometimes it's cheaper. And sometimes it's much cheaper. But it will look more expensive. The good news is that we can bring costs down by building more. But still, quality does come with a cost. It also comes with upsides though. Longevity and long-term value. Is traditional architecture too expensive? That entirely depends on what we find important. Unfortunately, our culture is obsessed by short-term gain. As a society, we have to ask ourselves what we find more important. Profit in the next quarter, or benefits for our children and great-grandchildren. As the saying goes, a society grows great when old men plant trees under whose shade they know they shall never sit. Maybe we should learn when investing extra is worth it. Because places last longer than we humans do. And more importantly, they shape us. Maybe we should train architects to create more beautiful designs with simple and effective design principles. And maybe we should start saving money by not spending it on stupid things, like megalomaniac projects. or so-called innovations that have failed in 10,000 other places. One thing is certain though, if we don't try to build beautifully, we never will. There have been many successful new traditional projects, which means it is possible. And since it's possible, this raises a new question. Why aren't we doing it more often? I leave that question to you to think about. I hope you found this video insightful or inspiring. If you did, consider following this channel to help it grow, or share this video with a colleague or friend. If you want to see examples of beautiful traditional architecture projects that were built all over the world, you will love the next video. For now, a big thank you to my patrons and thank you for watching.